Everyone hates fighting lucent moths, but hunters can steal them from the hive, thanks to the exotic Mothkeeper's wraps. Pair this with the exotic grenade launcher X Dirus, and they can be slinging moths left and right. Throwing moth grenades, they can blind enemies, jolt enemies, shield allies, and trigger several damage buffs this season. Controlling the battlefield, dealing AoE damage, and dealing great boss damage. It turns you into the ultimate moth monster. If this sounds good to you, you might enjoy this build. I'm Engineer. Let's focus first on the exotic, Mothkeeper's Wraps. This is the absolute cornerstone of this build, and it's one of the most unique exotic armors in the game, because it fully replaces your grenade ability with 2 ability charges of moth grenades. Each moth grenade will spawn 2 moths, and what those do depend on where they are relative to you and your allies and your enemies. When you throw the grenades and they're close to just enemies, they will turn into 2 arc grenades, and those arc grenades blind enemies. When they are close to allies only, they will turn to 2 void grenades, and those provide a void overshield to whichever ally or yourself that they impact. If you throw them between you and enemies, one will turn to an arc grenade and one to a void grenade. And this is just extremely versatile. It takes a little bit of practice to work on, but it works in a lot of different situations and gives you a lot of flexibility on the battlefield. A couple things to note here: void overshields have 70% damage resistance as of this season. These moth grenades are a unique grenade with a cooldown of 73 seconds and a 100% flat gain factor, which means they get the full value from every mod and source of flat grenade energy in the game. And they also buff the exotic special weapon X Dirus, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Overall, this exotic is very great and promotes a really unique game style. Now, to get this, you need to own Lightfall, and then you can either acquire it from Rahul's Precision Focusing or the Vex Strike Force public event on Neomuna. For stat priorities, focus on Resilience and Discipline, because it is a grenade-focused build, but some points in Recovery and Strength won't hurt you, and a few points in Intellect also can work. Now, let's talk about the aspects and abilities. First, the main aspect I recommend is Gunpowder Gamble. This seems like a weird suggestion, but it gives you a lot of great AoE and actually some healing because of the fragments we're using. You'll charge this up very quickly because you activate so many elemental debuffs, and it just provides great AoE damage. Now for your second aspect, it's much more flexible. I personally lean to Threaded Spectre because that gives you quick escapes and 3 fragment slots. But that Threaded Spectre can get killed very easily at higher difficulties, so maybe that won't work as well for you. Winter Shroud is pretty great crowd control and provides a debuff and increases your class ability regen whenever you slow enemies, which we'll be doing fairly frequently. You could also take Stylish Executioner to get some invisibility, which will trigger very frequently, but you do lose 1 fragment slot because it only has 2 fragment slots versus 3 that all the other aspects have. I don't personally like this though because the arc moths have some delay between when you throw them, when they hit enemies and kill them, so the activation of the invisibility can sometimes be a little bit inconsistent and not exactly when you want it, so that you accidentally exit the invisibility as soon as you get it. Lastly, Ascension doesn't really make sense here, as we're already going to get Jolt, and we don't really need another source of Amplify because we'll get that from our exotic weapon. Now for Super, this is somewhat flexible, but for this particular build, I recommend Storm's Edge, because it does pretty great damage, and it works with the artifact perk Arc Compounding. Now this super is really strong, but it does have the longest cooldown in the game currently, most likely thanks to PvP. So keep that in mind as you're building for it. Your grenade that you choose does not matter because it's going to get overwritten by your exotic. For our melee, we want Withering Blade, that's your Stasis Shuriken, because that's going to activate a couple artifact perks by applying slow. As for your class ability, I generally use Gambler's Dodge for the short cooldown and the melee restore, but you could also go for Acrobat's Dodge if you want a little bit more uptime on Radiant. Moving over to Fragments, we're going to take the always great Faceted Protection for defenses. For our grenade-focused Fragments, we're going to take Faceted Mending so that our grenades, every time they kill an enemy, will provide a Cure 1 to us for healing. Also take Faceted Dominance, which many don't realize actually applies to your Arc Moth grenade. Because it is classified as an arc grenade, those moths will now jolt on top of blinding enemies, which is a lot of debuffs at once, and can also increase your general AoE damage and your boss damage. For other ways of boosting our damage, we're going to take Facet of Courage. So lets our light abilities deal 10% increased damage to anything inflicted with a darkness debuff, like Slow from our Stasis Shuriken. We'll also be taking Facet of Non, so that Stasis Shuriken gives us 25% weapon damage bonus for 5 seconds every time it hits an enemy. Lastly, and this is probably the most flexible fragment, but I really like Facet of Awakening. We're doing a lot of arc damage in this build. and so this will cause us to generate ionic traces, and those ionic traces are one of the best elemental pickups in the game because they come back to you instantly and they restore grenade, melee, and class ability energy all at once. On mods and armor stats, we will generally be focusing on orb generation to get our super back pretty quickly and keep our armor charges rolling, and then we're going to use those armor charges for arc weapon damage. Otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. We're using grenade mods like Ashes to Assets to get some super energy back. We're going to use firepower to make orbs from grenades that way, and then we're using a couple mods to get class ability back or grenade energy back. On our class item, we want Powerful Attraction because it makes orb pickup even easier. We're going to take Time Dilation because anytime you're using armor charges that decay over time, like with weapon searches, you want them to last longer. And then we're also going to take a special ammo finisher. So if we run really low on ammo, but we have extra armor charges, we can use that to get our special ammo back. Armor stats are very standard here. We want to max resilience, we want to max discipline, get as much recovery as we can, get a little bit of strength to keep those buffs up, and then just make sure we're hitting 30 in intellect and mobility. I want to talk about artifact mods real quick. So in column 3, we have Trace Evidence, which gives us another source of ionic traces, which are already fantastic. If you decide to boost this, those ionic traces will give you armor charges. Over in column 4, we have Concussive Reload, which lets you apply Weaken when using your grenade launcher against stronger enemies. This is extremely great because Weaken is essentially a 15% damage bonus by reducing the enemy's damage resistance. You also have Curative Orbs, and that will let you generate an orb of power whenever you break a combatant's shield, which happens constantly in most endgame content. If you decide to boost this one, you can get healing on orbs of power or elemental pickups. Because we're using ionic traces, those come back to you, and it's basically automated healing as you kill stuff. Finally, in column 5, we have our main damage boosting perks. So we have Conductive Cosmic Crystal, and what that does is boost your arc ability, void ability, and Dark Eye the Reaper weapon damage on enemies that are affected by stasis debuffs. That's our Withering Blade in this case. So as we inflict that on enemies, they're going to take more damage from our arc abilities and our Dark Eye the Reaper weapons, which is really strong. Lastly, we have Arc Compounding, which gives us 15% increased arc, weapon, and ability damage against blinded enemies. All of our moths end up blinding enemies, so we're going to get that pretty constantly. What I recommend most to boost on this is Conductive Cosmic Crystal, because it takes that damage boost for abilities to 8% and Dark Other weapons up to 10%, and we're going to be building heavily into that for this. And getting into weapons, the main focus here is Exteris. This is a arc grenade launcher that's very similar to the Hive Boomer weapon that they shoot at you all the time. But when you get a kill or 2 direct hits, you'll summon it normally just an Arc Moth, but with Mothkeeper's Wraps, you also get a Void Moth. So as you're consistently getting those kills, you'll keep making Arc Moths for damage and Void Moths for shielding, which is really strong. On top of that, with the Catalyst, this will give you Amplified as you kill stuff, which is a boost to mobility and just generally gives you some extra speed on the field. Your Connect slot, it's pretty flexible. I don't have much preference here other than maybe something precise to hit your Gunpowder Gambles with. In your Heavy slot, we want an Arc Heavy to take advantage of Arc Compounding, but ideally we take Bittersweet because it is a Dark Eye the Reaper weapon and it will benefit from Conductive Cosmic Crystal. Now, I want to go over the total damage stacking here because there's a lot of numbers I've thrown out. So I made a table here of weapon boosts and ability boosts. So on the weapon side, we are stacking Radiant, Arc Compounding, Conductive Cosmic Crystal if we have a Dark Eye the Reaper weapon, Transcendence if we activate that for a 5% damage boost, and then Weapon Surges and Concussive Reload. You multiply all these factors together, and if you need a good reference for that, I will link Quartz stacking breakdown in the description, but you multiply those factors all together and you get 123% increased damage on this build, which is very fantastic. Now, some of those are short windows. Weaken lasts for 20 seconds and isn't refreshable, so you have to reapply it after the 20 seconds expires. The slow from Withering Blade only lasts 3.5 seconds, so you need to consistently hit that over and over again. Overall, very strong. On the ability side, you get 15% from Arc Compounding. You get to use Conductive Cosmic Crystal when boosted, Facet of Courage, and then that Weaken from Concussive Reload. And that totals out at 57%, which is lower, but abilities generally do really great damage, and this applies to your super if you're using the Arc Super. So that's extremely strong. I want to get into a little bit of gameplay, talk about the gameplay loop. So this is Birthplace of the Vile on Master difficulty, just to demonstrate it's solo and how you deal with champions and stuff. So you can see a lot of the enemies keep getting blinded by the grenades as they go out. We're getting those extra grenades from Exteris. These are excellent champion counters because we have Jolt, which counters overloads. We have Blind, which counters unstoppable champions. And this season we also have the Overload Grenade Launcher mod so that we can consistently keep those overloads stunned and not healing. Sometimes your grenades may get shot by enemies, which is a little bit annoying, but doesn't really hurt you too much, just spawns the moths earlier. You can see here we've generally not had much difficulty. We're usually over half our health, and Overshield's just really pretty tanky with this as long as you can manage the enemies and just keep those moths rolling. As we get down to a new enemy spawn, we're going to throw out the Moth grenade just to cast some Blind and Jolt out there. Have to be an unstoppable champion. Instantly stunned thanks to Blind. Throw a gunpowder gamble, and we've already got our super back despite the long cooldown. So we're going to use that to just weaken some of the enemies. Put a clone just to get some aggro off. And we've just put the grenade on the boss for blind. And then we're going to switch to our heavy grenade launcher, which lets us get pretty boosted damage. Just to summarize that gameplay loop one more time. Moths, if you throw them near enemies, you get pure blinding damage moths. If you throw them near yourself or allies, you get overshield moths. If you throw between, you get one of each. When you're focused on damage, you want to throw the moth grenade on the enemy for blind. Activate Transcendence for the buff, which will lock out your moth grenades, so use them all up first. Then you're going to throw a Withering Blade for Radiant and Conductive Cosmic Crystal, and Facet of Courage. And then you're going to fire a Grenade Launcher for Weaken, and just unleash as much damage as quickly as you can before those buffs start falling off. This will do pretty great damage in most situations, very flexible, and just generally a really solid build. I've had so much fun playing it and testing it out this week, and I hope you enjoy it too. That's pretty much all I've got for the build. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments or if you have any feedback or other ideas that you've tried. And with that, I'll let you go. Thank you.